All right, welcome everybody. Oops, excuse me. Welcome to the February 21st meeting of the PASS Security Virtual Group. Today we present SQL Server Security Basics with our special guest, Kenneth Fisher. First, I have a little bit of PASS news to get through. As some of you may know, the PASS Summit 2019 registration is open. There's still some pretty substantial discounts for early bird registration, so if you're going to go, now's the time to sign up. There's also the PASS Data Expert Series is available. This is an on-demand set of recordings from previous PASS summits for architecture, data management, and analytics. They're all available for download, for streaming or full download at just $129 each, or you can buy them in a bundle. The Microsoft Roadshow for SQL Server and Azure Data Services is making its rounds around the United States and around the world, I think. So you should look online, see if you can find an event near you using that link below. There are a number of upcoming virtual group webinars. And if you haven't looked for virtual groups in an area that interests you, there are quite a number of them. A small sampling is here. You should definitely check them out. Likewise, there are a number of SQL Saturdays coming up. It's a great opportunity for a whole day of really top-notch free training provided by members of the SQL Server community. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to connect with PASS either on Twitter or online at pass.org. You can sign up just as a member, or if you'd like to volunteer, we'd love to have you. And with that, I will throw it over to Kenneth for SQL Server Security Basics.
Okay, everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm gonna assume yes. Okay, good. All right, so I'm gonna go pretty quickly here because I've got a lot of information. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll take periodic breaks to answer questions. Real quick, I want to point out that my blog is on SQLstudies.com. You feel free to leave me comments there. You can also contact me on Twitter at SQLstudent144. I'm on Twitter quite a bit. Just ask my wife. And you can always send me emails at SQLstudent144@gmail.com. Now, I point this out so that you are aware there is a theme there. I give homework, and at the end, there will be a quiz. So, to get started, I would like everyone to please raise your hand. Yes, I know it's a webinar. Nobody's going to see you, so just go ahead and do it. Even you in the back. All right. Who here is responsible for security? Very good. We all are. I don't care if you are the CEO, the CIO, a developer, the DBA. I don't care if you are the person who takes the trash out in the evenings. We are all responsible for the security of our company, or for the security of our company's data. Okay? Now, to that end, we are going to assume in this session that you know absolutely nothing about how to secure a SQL Server instance, and we're going to get you up to at least competent, okay? Or to at least comfortable with how it all works. And we're going to do that. We're going to start with definitions. I like starting with definitions. I've found over the years that in particular with technology, if we're not using the same words, the same terms, and we don't mean the same thing when we use them, there's a lot of confusion, and we make mistakes, and there's all kinds of problems. So we start with definitions. Then we're going to move on to the GUI. If you are a beginner, you are probably going to be using the GUI. If you are a senior level person, you probably will avoid the GUI as much as possible. That said, the GUI is always a good place to start. And as good as the GUI is, and let me tell you, Microsoft has provided us with an excellent GUI in SQL Server Management Studio. You will not see better, or not much better. That said, security is not as good as it could be. It's not as intuitive as other things within SSMS. Last but not least, we're going to go on to best practices. Everybody's favorite. I have a strongly held belief about best practices. Okay, best practices are rules that some very smart people came up with through hard work, through a lot of practicing, through a lot of testing. They are rules that apply in most situations, for most people, most of the time. That most is very important. It is not always the best rule. I'm a firm believer that you should always know why something is a best practice, not just that it is the best practice. So as I go through these, I'm going to try and explain why they are the way they are, so that you will know when your situation demands doing something different. All right, so definitions. We have principals, we have securables, and we have permissions. And we're going to start right in at the bottom. A permission is, what do you want to be allowed to do? I want to come in your house. May I? I want to run a select on a table. Can I? There are a lot of permissions within SQL Server. Every object within SQL Server has its own set of permissions. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they aren't. There are a lot of them. Do not feel like you need to memorize them all. I don't have them all memorized. I don't know anybody who does. That said, being familiar with them is important. I've got a handful of them here that I'm going to go through that will hopefully get you started, make it a little easier as you move on. All right, so tables and views, you have a select permission that allows you to run a select statement. Insert, update, and delete state permissions lets you run insert, update, and delete permissions. Pretty easy. Store procedures and functions. Execute permission lets you execute them. Store procedures, functions, and views. You have view definition. This one's a little bit trickier, a little less obvious. View definition allows you to see the code that makes up that store procedure, function, and view. All right, it does not work on encrypted store procedures, CLR, that type of thing. But for basic stuff, it's what lets you see the code. And it might help to remember the permission name if you understand that the system view that stores this stuff, the column that contains the code is the definition column. Now, just to make things more complicated, logins and users also have a view definition permission. This permission allows you to see that user or login allows you to see their permissions. And that one is completely confusing, and I have no idea why it's named that way. Databases, you have a connect permission. This just lets you in the door. I can come in the house. I can't look at anything. I can't do anything. I can't go anywhere. That's all you can do. You can connect to the database and nothing else. At the server level, this is called Connect SQL. Used to be also called Connect, just to make things confusing. You also have a backup permission that lets you run backup statements. You have create procedure. And you would think this would let you create a stored procedure. And it does, kind of. But this is one of a group of permissions where you have to have more than one permission in order to do a given task. If you have create procedure and you try to create a stored procedure, it'll fail. And the reasoning behind this, or at least as I see it, is you have to have a place to put it. Now, all code within SQL Server is in schemas. All right, the schema is the container for the stored procedure. If you don't have the ability to modify the schema to put the procedure in it, then your create procedure is going to fail. To that end, you must also have alter schema. So if alter schema and create procedure, create view, whatever, will actually let you create the objects. All right, last but not least, we have view database state. There's also a view server state, and these give you access to the DMVs, database management views, and database management functions that give you information about the database and server state. Now, this picture in the bottom right corner here, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not. There's a link here. This is homework part 1. Download the PowerPoint. I'll give it to Dan and he can post it somewhere. Download the PowerPoint, open the link. It is a fantastic poster on SQL Server permissions. Okay, don't expect anyone to save it to your desktop, to make it your wallpaper, to print it out and put it on your bedroom wall, anything like that. Be aware that it exists, though. Be aware that it exists. Go take a look at it when you need it. It will help you understand and help you figure out where the permissions are. So it'll tell you what they do, but it'll tell you how they layer. Okay, securables. This is what permission, or what do you want permission to? I want to come in the house is the securable. Okay, I want to select from a table, the table is the securable. Now, most securables within SQL Server, I say most, a lot of securables within SQL Server are also containers. They contain other securables. Databases are securables, they contain schemas, which are securables, and containers, and contain tables and stored procedures and functions and views and so on and so forth. Tables are securables, and believe it or not, are also containers. They contain columns. You can, in fact, do column level security. In the 20, 30 years I've been doing databases, I have never once done column level security. There's an easier way to handle the same task and the same problem. I will try to remember to hit that a little bit later, but I tend to miss it. So if I skip that, feel free to ask me later. All right, real quick. The reason I mention these are containers, very important thing. If you apply a permission to a container, you have effectively applied that permission to everything within that container. So if I grant you select at the database level, you can read from every table and view within the database. If I grant you execute at the schema level, you can execute every stored procedure and function within that schema. It's important to remember that. Instances are also securables. They have their own set of permissions. They are also containers. They contain databases. The permissions at the instance level do not act the same the way permissions do elsewhere, in that if you have a permission at the instance level, connect SQL, for example, that has no effect on anything within it. There are specific permissions at the instance level, connect any database, view any definition, that do give you permissions within databases, but they explicitly tell you that they're going to. Principals. Principal is who wants permission. Okay, I want to come in your house, I am a principal. I want to run a select on a table, I am the principal. There are a lot of different kinds of principals within SQL Server. And they all break down into 2 categories, server and database, otherwise known as logins and users. Now, remember how I said that people tend to get confused about unless you're using the same words in the same way? This is one of those, a great example of that. I do not like the term login and user. They are correct. The commands are create login, create user. However, in spite of what I said a minute ago, I am not a principal, but I am a user. And when I connect to the network in the morning, I use my login or perhaps my user, depending on who you're talking to, that has absolutely nothing to do with database permissions. The terms are very heavily overloaded. They mean a lot of different things. So my recommendation to you, use the term login, use the term user, but in your head, think server principal, database principal. That way, when someone comes up to you and says, hey, I need a login for this database, you can start asking questions. You can say, okay, when you say that, do you mean you need a user for the database and you already have a login? Or do you mean you want a login for the SQL Server instance? Because if I remember correctly, in Oracle, the equivalent of the SQL Server instance is actually called a database. Okay, like I said, you got to know when to ask questions. All right, so different types of logins and users. We have SQL Server logins and SQL Server users, Active Directory and Windows authenticated logins and users, Active Directory and Windows authenticated groups at the server and database level, and logins and users mapped to certificates and asymmetric keys. We also have roles at the server and database level, which are not logins and users, but are principals. So what is a role? A role is a type of principal that is also a container for other types of principals. Okay, I'm getting a warning saying that you guys may not be able to hear me okay. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you all right.
All right, we'll keep going then. So roles are principals. They are also containers for other principals. You put members in a role, you grant the role permissions. Every member of that role now effectively has those permissions. Notice I used the word effectively several times now. Not directly granted permissions, effectively grant permissions. Now we have two different kinds of roles within the server and the database levels. You have built-in roles. These are things like sysadmin, bulk admin, DB data reader, DB data writer. This is the stuff that's installed when you install SQL Server, that's created for you. They are also fixed. You cannot change their permissions. DB data reader will always grant select at the database level. There's nothing you can do to change that. You can't add permissions. You can't remove permissions. Unless Microsoft decides at some point to change that, and I don't see that happening. So you do have some built-in roles that are not fixed. These are found in MSDB. And if you ever need to do some kind of weird permission and you're not sure where to put it, it's going to probably be one of those roles in MSDB. That's where you're going to get permissions for the agent. That's where you're going to see permissions for SSIS, for CLR, things like that. Now, those roles are not fixed. You can change them. But as with many things in SQL Server and in life, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Anecdotally, what's going to happen to you if you change one of those sets of permissions? A couple of years later, you're going to have a big install that you're working on, and you're testing in dev, and you use one of these roles, and it works fine. So you move on to test, and it still worked great. Model, everything's working fine. So you schedule your big production upgrade. Friday night, you bring the application down, you start making your changes, and you do your testing on Saturday, and it doesn't work. It fails. So you have to back everything out, and you spend the next few weeks trying to figure out what went wrong. The role works everywhere else, but not in production. You come up with workarounds. None of them work very well. You put in hours and hours and hours of effort until someone points out that a few years back, someone ran a hardening script that changed the permissions in some of these roles. I will warn you, there are a lot of permissions involved. Getting these things fixed is a nightmare. Do not change the built-in roles. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Anyway, so we've got built-in roles. We've got some that are fixed and some that aren't. Fixed, we can't change the permissions. Not fixed, we shouldn't change them. So what do? We use user-defined roles. User-defined roles are the ones where we create the role, we add the permissions, we add members, and we move on. And this is where the real power of roles comes in, because roles are principals and they are containers for principals. This means you can stack them. This means I can have a user role with select access on 10 tables and write access on 5, and an admin role that has write access to the other 5 tables and is a member of the user role. Now, if I ever make changes to that user role, if I add a new table or remove an old table, that affects the admin. The admin automatically has those permissions changed as well. Now, in the bottom corner here, again, another link. This is kind of an old link. It takes you to a page saying that this page is expired, and it sends you links to 2 other places. It's the only place I could find that had links to both posters, the server level and the database level roles posters. Okay, again, take a look at them, scan through them, figure out what they're showing you so that later you can use them as reference material. Okay. Next thing to do in your next piece of homework is, if you look, you'll see these 6 system views. Okay. Cool thing about SQL Server is it is a relational database system. All right, an RDBMS. That means that we have tables, we have views, we have functions, all that stuff, and Microsoft has them too, and they use them. So there are system functions and system store procedures and system views. These are the system views that contain all the information that we have just talked about. All right, and they are very, very well named and very, very well put together. And if you skim through them and you read, you look at what they are and how they're laid out, it will help reinforce everything that we've talked about so far. At the instance level, you have the server principals, permissions, and role members. And at the database level, you have the database principals, permissions, and role members. All right. The 3 tables here are linked together. The 3 tables here are linked together. These are not everything. Okay, there are a lot of store procedures and functions and views within SQL Server that will give you security information. These are just the core information. I highly recommend going out and finding some of your own. And every time I give this presentation, I try to mention at least one of them. It's different every time. I don't keep it in my notes. I just kind of pick something when I give the presentation. So take a look at sys.fn_my_permissions. Okay, it is a system function. Take a look, see what information it gives you. Go to books online, read about it, whatever. If you run into any problems with it, feel free to contact me. I'll be glad to help. If you have any great successes, you figure out something you think is cool, feel free to tell me. I'm still learning this stuff too. A lot of us are still learning this stuff. All of us are, really. And you might hit on something that I've never seen before, and I love that. Okay, I love learning new things. So just to repeat, sys.fn_my_permissions. All right. Now, as I was saying, these things are linked together. The server and the database level principles are linked together. That's the relational part of a relational database management system. And if you go take a look at the server principles and the database principles views, you're going to find 3 columns that are identical. All right, principal ID, name, and SID. The principal ID does not tie these 2 together. Okay, it ties the server level views together and the database level views together, but not to each other. All right, best I can tell, it's an identity column. At least that's what it acts like. And when you add a new server principal, you get a new principal ID at the server level. When you add a new database principal, a new user or whatever, you get a new principal ID at the database level. They can be completely different. Okay, name. If you have ever done any database design, you will know that name is possibly the worst thing you can use to join two tables together for various reasons. However, we are human beings. We like to use names. Okay, we like to have names for things rather than numbers and symbols and things. If you are not careful, you will lose a lot of time. I do not want to think about how many hours I have lost looking at the server principal level for a particular name that I'm seeing at the database level, or vice versa. You know, I've got domain/user at the server level and I'm not seeing it at the database level. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why. Until I go back and remember, I'm being an idiot, that it's the name. I don't want to be looking at the name. And the name at the server and the database level do not have to be the same. Okay? You would think that they would, but they don't. Your name at the server level could be Bob, and your database principal name could be Susie. It doesn't matter. Okay? Because what ties those two things together is the SID. Okay? The SID is the security identifier, I think is what that stands for. And it's a var binary. And you'll notice it's got a different length depending on where it comes from. If it is a SQL Server login, it's one length. It's created by SQL Server. If it's an Active Directory login or group, then it's created by Active Directory or Windows, depending on where you're getting it. And you'll notice it's another length. Certificates, that's actually a hash of the public key, which I don't know about y'all, but I found that very interesting. So this is how these two are tied together. And when they don't match, you get an orphan. If you work with databases, you will run into orphaned users. Okay? As a DBA, you are going to get users that come up to you and say, hey, I was able to log into this database before, but I can't anymore. What's going on? And if you're a developer, you are going to walk up to your DBA one day and say, hey, I used to be able to connect to this database. I can't anymore. What's going on? It will happen. And the most common reason this happens is when you're copying a database from one server to another. And you'll notice something's missing. Okay? There's no login on server B, right? There's the user, because I copied that over, but I don't have a login. And that's easy enough to fix, right? Create login from Windows. No problem. And everything's good. Everything's golden. And that works really well if it's Windows authenticated. When it's SQL authenticated, it works a little bit differently. Copy the database, create the login, and you'll notice right here, there's a problem. Okay? There's no tie between the login and the user. That's because the SID is different. And this is pretty easy to fix, okay? On older systems, you use SP change users login. On newer systems, really on anything you're likely to be using right now, you're going to use alter user with login. Okay? And that will change the SID at the database level. And that fixes it. But it does have a slight problem. Because next month, when the developer says, hey, would you refresh this database, and you copy it back over again, you'll notice you've got a problem. And this is one of those times when the developer is going to come up to you and say, hey, something's went wrong. Why can't I connect? And you're going to go, oh yeah, I forgot. And you're going to fix it. And that's great. And a month later, the developer is going to say, hey, would you refresh that database? And then they're going to come up to you and say, hey, something's wrong, I can't connect. Did you forget to do that thing that fixes it? Oh yeah, I forgot. Now, the second time's probably not a big deal. After the fifth, sixth, dozen times, your users start to wonder if you know what you're doing. They will start putting explicitly in their requests, remember to fix the SID. And if you keep forgetting, they're going to give you funny looks and they're going to get frustrated. Don't ask me how I know. We'll just say a friend told me. So how do we fix this? How do we stop this from happening? Well, we copy our database over just like we did earlier. All right. But rather than fixing the SID at the database level, when we create the login, when we create the server principal, we make sure to include the SID. We tell it which SID we want to use. Now, if you are new to T-SQL, if you have not worked with this much, this can look intimidating, and this is not something you can do in the GUI. All right, some things you just can't do in the GUI. This is one of them. Do not be intimidated. This is really not that hard, but if you need help with this, there are a lot of scripts out there that will help you. Microsoft has one called SP Help Rev Login, if I remember correctly. I've got a couple on my on my blog. The late great Robert Davis has someone his. They're all over the place. Okay, and as a bonus, most of them will copy the password as well. They will take the hash of the password, because that's how it's stored in SQL Server, as a hash, and will copy that hash into the command. And in the create command, they will tell SQL Server it is pre-hashed, go ahead and just use it. And that way you can copy your login, your server principal, without ever having to know the password. And I can tell you from long experience as a DBA, I want to know as few passwords as possible. I do not like knowing passwords. All right. As with every rule, we have exceptions. Roles. The SID for server and database level roles has nothing to do with each other. I don't care if they were the same. Roles just don't have anything to do with each other. I wish you could. I wish you could make a tie between server and database level roles, and maybe Microsoft will do that at some point. But right now, they have nothing to do with each other. The other exception is contained databases. This was Microsoft's solution to the orphan user problem. All of the information you need to connect to the database, the password, everything else is contained within the database. So when you copy it from one server to another, it goes with. This is also one of those things that Microsoft did that they started and they created a pretty cool option, and unfortunately that's where they stopped and haven't gone any farther. So it works pretty well. Be aware that it's an option. I don't see it used a whole lot. All right, so how do we tie all this together? How do we grant these permissions? Well, we use grant, and grant applies a positive permission. All right, it says you can do this. You can select from the table. You can execute this store procedure. Deny, it's the opposite, and it also applies a permission. It applies a negative permission. It says you cannot do this. You cannot select. You cannot execute. But it does apply a permission. And if you ever want to prove that to yourself, go back and look at those system views, do a grant, do a deny, and then take a look in the system view, and you will see entries for each of them, as long as you make them for different permissions and different objects, because you can't have both a grant and deny at the same time for the same thing. All right, these two combined. The opposite is revoke. Revoke removes a permission. it will remove a grant or a deny. And again, you can go look at the system views, run a revoke, and you'll see the line disappear, the row disappear. All right, this is an important one. This throws people a lot. Grant and deny are opposites. Grant and deny combined are the opposite of revoke. Okay, grant and deny apply a permission, positive or negative. Revoke removes a permission. Now, I have had a number of questions over the years giving this presentation. Why is deny in a bigger font? Deny is in a bigger font because deny trumps grant. If you have one deny, it will trump 100 grants. I don't care if you were granted the permission through several dozen different Active Directory groups, at the database level, at the object level, at the schema level, one deny and you can't do it. Okay? It is in fact such a big deal that I will frequently go look and see if there is a deny within the system view and then see if that deny applies back to my problem. All right? So be very, very careful about your denies. They can have very far-reaching effects. All right, I'm going to blur through this because I'm running a little bit late. Administrative principals and permissions. These are the 6 guys that control everything. Okay? At the instance level, SA, sysadmin, control server, database, DBO, DB owner, control database. Everybody knows what SA and sysadmin are. DBO is the one, the only, the owner of the database. There can be only one. It gets confused with DB owner sometimes. DB owner is a role. Members of the DB owner role have almost as many permissions as DBO. And in fact, the big difference and the reason for this blue line here is the stuff on the left is the exception to that deny rule. SA, sysadmin, and the database owner cannot be denied anything. And in fact, I don't even think Microsoft, I don't think SQL Server checks your permissions. If you are SA or sysadmin or DBO, I don't even think it checks to see if you have permission, or if there's a deny out there, it just lets you do it. DB owner is the opposite, okay? And a commonly held misunderstanding, you can be denied even if you're a member of the DB owner role. All right? Also, just fair warning, there are a lot of permissions involved with DB owner. People get the idea that they can go ahead and grant someone DB owner and then deny permissions they don't want them to have. It probably won't work. All right, you're almost certainly going to miss something, and you're very likely to deny them something you need to be able to do. I don't recommend it. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and do my GUI demo. And again, I'm going to go kind of fast because I'm kind of running low on time here. So to start, everybody is familiar with this, right? This is Object Explorer within SQL Server Management Studio. You will notice at the top, hold on. Okay, you have instance. This is a securable. You have a security dropdown. These are where all of your principals exist. Okay, if I hit this, I get logins and roles. These are my principals. If I go within a database, there is also a security dropdown. And again, this is where I'm going to find my principals. Everything else is securables, just about. And how you find information about each, how you find the security, is different whether you're a principal or securable. So starting at the top with the instance level, right click, okay, on securables, you right click, you go to properties, and there is a permissions tab. And you have a list of all the associated principals and what permissions they have. Okay, so if I go down here to the Cowardly Lion has Connect SQL, and that is it. Okay, that should be all they have, yeah. You'll notice there's a checkbox under the grant option, nothing under deny, and I'll get to with grant in a minute. Dorothy Gale also has connect and has administer bulk operations. Okay? And that's how you find your instance level permissions. Okay, so at the database level, same thing. We're talking about securables. Right click, go to properties, go to the permissions tab. And now we'll see our users and roles, our database level securables, our principals, I mean, and you can select one. Dorothy Gale has, and we scroll down, they have connect, and they have execute at the database level. Okay, this is how I tell what permissions there are for this specific object. Now, here's a cool thing. There's an effective tab right here. If I click on this, this tells me what options I've got. Okay, what they actually, permissions do they actually have, even if it isn't listed here. And you'll notice that several of them aren't. Okay, that's because this particular person has permissions at the instance level that they don't have, that aren't showing here. Okay. So let's move down, and we're going to take a look at a table. And again, another securable. We'll go with the Emerald Palace. All right. Open up the Emerald Palace, and again, there's a permissions tab. Now you'll notice this time I'm only seeing the flying monkeys, which is a database role, and it has alter on DBO, or no, sorry, it has alter on this table, and select on this table. And again, I can go to effective, and it doesn't work for roles. All right, let's say I want to add somebody. Okay, I want to add a user. I can hit search. I can hit browse in this case because there aren't very many. I can specify which object type I want up here just to make it easier. And we'll add Dorothy Gale. Hit OK. And Dorothy Gale is not going to have any permissions here explicitly listed. If I go to effective, they do. They have select. Because remember, they had select at the database level. Now, another thing real quick. You'll notice that there's two entries for select. One is without a column entry. That means that they have permissions at the table level to this table. If they have, they also have access to this column. If you're doing column level security, then you won't see this. You'll just see a list of columns. And in this case, this table only has one column, I believe. And if I want to grant a permission, let's say I want to grant insert, I can hit this. And then there's this really cool little button up here called script. Click that. And it's going to give me the script to do the grant. All right. So if you are trying to transition from the GUI to using scripts, and I do recommend that over time, this is a really, really good way to learn how to do this stuff. Do what you need to do in the GUI, and then script it. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can read that a little easier. All right. So that's securables. Now, if I'm going to go to, we're going to skim down here to our logins, and we're going to take a look at principals now. And again, I'm going to go look at Dorothy Gale. And with principals, I can double click, and that'll take me in and bring it up. I can also right click and go to properties, because all of this is permissions, okay, is information about this. And you'll see the basics here, their password, whether they're Windows authenticated or SQL authenticated, in this case SQL authenticated with a password, whether they have credentials, and so on. at the server level principal section, okay, this is the server roles that they're a member of. You'll notice they're only a member of public. User mapping, this is specific to logins, okay? You'll only see this for logins, and this will show you what roles somebody has within a given database. It will also tell you what the name of the server of the database principal for this server principal. Because remember, it doesn't have to be the same. So if I click on this, I'm now going to see they are a member of the DB data reader role and public. If I go to master, they also have DB data reader and public. I could add something here, and again, hit script, and it would tell me how to do that. This is a handy way to add somebody to a given database and to grant role permissions. It does not let you grant actual individual permissions. Securables. This is a list of securables that they have access to. Again, I can hit search up here, and I can get specific types of objects or whatever. In this case, we are going to, sorry, I keep moving things out of the way. We're going to take a look at roles. And you can add these and grant them access to them. Okay? Although, again, bulk admin's fixed, so you're not really going to be able to do much. All right. Real quick look at server level roles. We're just going to go ahead and take a look at sysadmin. These are the sysadmins. That's all there is. For this particular type, unless it's a user defined, all you're ever going to see is what members there are. All right. At the database level role, users. Dorothy Gale. General, okay, username, login name, default schema. What schemas do they own? What roles are they a member of? Securables. Again, we can search and we're going to add tables here. We'll browse and we'll add houses. Okay. Currently, no permissions are involved. That's why I had to add it. If there are any permissions already granted, then it's already going to be there in this list. You generally only want to add it to the list if you want to add permissions. Okay, and here I can grant, delete, insert, select, update, and so on. Now, this with grant thing. With grant basically means that I am granting someone the permission. We'll turn off select. If I click with grant, they automatically get a grant. Okay, see how it's automatically added right here? With grant says that not only can you do it, but you can let somebody else do it if you want. Okay? And last thing I'm going to do here is look at this role, just so that you can see now, because this is not a fixed role, not only do I have role members, I have the option to add own schemas and grant specific permissions. So the Flying Monkeys have alter access on the Emerald Palace. Okay? All right. Best practices. Everybody loves best practices, right? So I've got my best practices grouped into 3 groups, which are themselves really best practices, and everything else is details. We have least maintenance, least surface area, least privileges. Least is probably the most important thing you are ever going to learn about security. Less is more. Least maintenance. Make your life as easy as you can. Okay? Don't make permissions any more granular than you have to. Grant your permissions at the database level when possible. If not, add them at the schema. Worst case, add them at the object level. The reason you do this is because that way, if somebody adds a new table, they automatically have select permission because you granted it at the database level, and you don't have to go back and do it manually. This makes your life easier. Think in terms of you have 1,000 instances with 10,000 or 100,000 databases. How much work is this to maintain every single object, to maintain the security on each individual object? Use roles in Active Directory or Windows groups. Use them together. They can really make your life easier. Best example I ever saw was a case where the roles were application tasks. I need to be able to take a call for a call center. So taking a call was a role. All right, it had all the permissions required for someone to be able to take a role or take a call. I mean, at the Active Directory group level, this was position within the company. All right, so I am a call center supervisor or I am a call center person. I am a member of that group. That group is a member of the role. And here's what that buys you. If permissions change for being able to take a call, I change that at the role level. That's easy. If somebody changes position with the company, they go from call center person to call center supervisor or to accountant. They shift jobs completely. You remove them from the groups they belong to, and you add them to the groups, to the new groups that they're moving to. Somebody is added to the company, you put them in the right groups, and everybody has the permissions they need. All right? Be consistent. This is not really a database thing. This is everybody. All right? This is life. Be consistent. Remember I said you've got 1,000 instances and tens of thousands of databases? If I have to go in and explain to a new hire how permissions work on each one of those individually, because it's different for every single day, every single server and possibly some of the databases, I'm going to be at that all year. If, on the other hand, I say this is how we do security across the board, here are the 5 exceptions. I'll be done in time for lunch. Okay? Be consistent. It will make your life easier in so many ways. Least surface area. Security has 2 purposes. Purpose number 1, it's to prevent accidents. All right? If you shouldn't be able to do it, don't be able to do it, because let's face it, accidents happen. Least surface area is about the other one. This is they're out to get you. It is only paranoia if they're not really out to get you. And if you look at, if you're on social media at all, you will see they are out to get you. The number of breaches, the number of hacked accounts, the number of hacked servers is just tremendous. They want your data. Somebody wants it. Somebody is trying to get your information, whether you know it or not. Let's make it as hard on them as possible. If you don't need it on that server, it either should be disabled or not there at all. And there are cases for both. All right, SSIS, for example. Okay, if I make SSIS available, someone is going to use it. Someone is going to load data into a table, and they could load a terabyte of data into this table and completely trash my server. Okay, they could export data that they really shouldn't be exporting in mass. Okay, but if it's not there, well, if it's there anywhere, they can get to it. But either way, the resources used are not going to be used on my database server. Okay, same goes for external apps, drivers, etc. Don't put them on the server unless they need to be there. Same goes for extra databases. Don't put extra databases on your server. I have production here, even in your development environment. Okay, AdventureWorks, for example, doesn't belong on any work environment. You know, that's a great test database. Wide World Importers is another one. It's the newer one. Those belong on your machine, okay, on your personal instance that you practice on. They don't belong on shared servers, because stuff that you do in there is going to tie up resources that other people may need. Great example for production. Let's say you've got a legal database. This legal database has information from 4 years ago. You don't need it anymore, but legal has said we have to keep it available for 7 years. All right, take a backup, encrypt the backup, put it on a secure location, get it off your server. That way, if and when a breach happens, they get into your server, they can't get to that legal information because it's not there. Otherwise, the breach happens, they may or may not have gotten the legal information, but now legal's telling you they've got to open the whole thing back up again because information has been exposed. Okay, don't put it there if you don't need it there. Same goes for SQL Server protocols. There are 3 of them: TCP/IP, name pipes, shared memory. You only need shared memory if you're logging in from the machine. There are cases where that happens. If you don't need to be able to do that, don't use shared memory. TCP/IP name pipes are only needed if you are coming in from outside of the server. Okay, so if this is one of those rare servers, and they do happen, where you have to remote to the server in order to connect to it, then they don't need to be activated. And the reason is because someone may come up with a vulnerability, let's say to named pipes, which is rarely used anymore, but someone figures out a vulnerability there. If you don't have named pipes available, if named pipes is turned off, then that vulnerability doesn't affect you. Least privilege. This is the one.
Excuse me, Kenneth. I'm sorry, I have one question has come in if you'd like to take that now.
Sure.
The question is, if you have an Active Directory group, like a read-only group for a development environment, and the same group is in production, but you don't want some users in that group to read data in production, what would you do?
I would have 2 different groups. Well, okay, so if I've got a group in, let's say, developers in the development environment, okay, and but in production, I still have that same group available, and they should be able to, say, read everything from this database, but this other database, they can only see a few things, or, only some of them can see stuff. Then those exception people, those people that I don't want to have, or that I want to have more permissions than the other group, I would have a different group for them. Okay, because they are performing a task that everybody else isn't. Okay, they might be the senior level developers and they have special access, or they might be the developers who have a security clearance, in which case, again, they should have their own group, and that group then has its own access available to it. Does that make sense?
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, so least privilege. This is that other reason for security mistakes. It's also going to stop people. It's also going to stop people who are after your data. If you don't need a permission, if one of your users does not need a permission, then they shouldn't have it. You should only have the permissions that you need to do your job. This is not an overly popular opinion, but in my opinion, developers don't need DB owner, even in development environments. I have actually had an occasion where late Friday, I had a developer in a bit of a panic because they dropped their shared development database. Because DB owner doesn't just let you drop tables, it lets you drop the database. It lets you take backups that can mess with your backup chain. It lets you do all kinds of things that you don't need to be able to do. Generally, what I've found is that read, write, execute, DDL admin, maybe bulk admin are 99% of anything a developer needs to be able to do. I have seen exceptions. Sometimes you need more, and in which case you should be granted more. But DB owner is just way too powerful. Granting permissions on views and store procedures and that type of thing, rather than granting permissions on the underlying tables, it's a development choice. It's what Microsoft does. Remember, I've talked about system views, and I haven't mentioned system tables, that's because we don't actually have access to the system tables. And in fact, without doing some weird, funky stuff, you can't even see the system tables that they exist. All right, and we certainly don't have write access to them. Again, this is a development decision. I've seen it done really well both ways. Okay, grant your permissions at the lowest level you possibly can. Grant them at the object level, if at all possible. If not, grant them at the schema level. Only grant permissions at the database level if you absolutely have to. Now, when I am giving this presentation in person, I usually wait a few seconds to see if anybody's going to call me on this. I'm just going to go ahead and mention it here. If you look at that last point and you look at this first point, they are the exact opposite. And I did my best to word them as close to the same as possible. There's a reason for this. Because security is one of those things where it's a balance. It's all give and take. Security, we have to, on the one hand, one of our primary jobs, make sure that our users can do their work. They have to be able to do their job. But they shouldn't be able to do anything past that. On the other hand, we have to be able to maintain the system. If we have 1,000 instances, there is just no way we can maintain the system at an object level. So we have to do it at the database level and then have exceptions. This database is particularly secure, so I'm going to do things differently here, and I'm going to grant my permissions at the object level here. Okay? We have to be able to do our job, but so does everybody else. And at the same time, we've got to protect our data. We've got to protect our systems. Because here's the thing. If security, physical security is not doing its job, if the network people aren't doing their job, if the server people aren't doing their job, if we aren't doing our job, if we all aren't doing our job together, well, there's a reason why we're at the center of a bullseye. They are out to get your data, and mistakes happen. And we have to do what we can to protect ourselves from that. All right? So if there are any more questions, and here's your quiz. So were there any other questions?
We'll give a minute for questions to come in, but there are none at the moment.
Okay.
Oh, actually, I have one now.
Okay.
Where can we script or see the grants on a view or store procedure? For example, if a view was dropped that had grants, but we want to script out the grants before it's dropped so we can add it back.
Okay, when you go to script a store procedure, there are a couple of options here. So first of all, if you just want to look at them, see if I even have a store procedure in here, and I'm not sure that I do. Oh, I do. Okay. If I go to properties, permissions, I can see what explicit permissions were granted here. I don't have any at the moment. But the other thing you can do is when you script it out, if you go to Tools, Options, and if you look down here, let me see if I can find it real quick. Designers, nope, table designers. Sorry, this is not something I go to very often. You know what, let's just look up here. There we go, Object Explorer Scripting. And you will see a long list of options. One of which is going to be, if I can find it, script, there we go, script permissions. And if you change script permissions to true, then when you script out the object, I'll go ahead and do that real quick, and I'll go to my table, script table, and it's taking a second. There we go. And you'll notice the permissions were scripted with it. Don't forget though, newer versions of SQL Server, and by newer I think it was 2016 and up, have the option on stored procedures to do create or alter rather than just create or alter. There's a create or alter command that will create it if it needs to be created or alter it if it needs to be altered. And then you don't have to worry about scripting out your permissions.
That's great, Kenneth. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we'll wrap up. That was a really great presentation. I really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you to everybody else for logging in and giving a listen. I hope everybody got a chance to learn something. We'll have the session and slides uploaded within a few days, and hopefully we'll see you next month for another presentation. So keep your eyes on your email. And thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.